So I think we can get started. Today's session is called Prosperity's Path, a Blueprint for Canada's Future. And of course, it builds off Danny's fascinating 5-article series for the Globe and Mail, but it doesn't only build off that series, it builds off the work that Danny has done in Canada over the last several years. It builds off his leadership in the Innovation Policy Lab. So there is a depth of knowledge on an absolutely pressing problem for Canada right now that Danny has. So let me tell you just a little bit about Danny if you don't know him. He is a university professor, which is the highest distinction we give to faculty across the university. He's the Munk Chair of Innovation Studies at the Munk School of Global Affairs here in Public Policy. He is cross-appointed to political science. He is director of the Innovation Policy Lab, and he has 2 colleagues with him in the front row, without whom the lab would not be what it is. Foremost among them is Janice Breznitz, and we always say there is no relationship to the speaker, it's a pure coincidence, but in this case, there is a relationship to the speaker, and Tom Kevany, both of them. What did I miss? Oh, Darius and Darius Warnston. 3 of them, 3 of Danny's colleagues are there. Danny is also a fellow of the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR, where he co-founded and co-directed their signature program on innovation, equality, and the future of prosperity. Now, I could go on and say a lot more about Danny, but Danny's saying enough. But Danny's work, I think, touches on a subject that is getting attention from everybody in the country now. Frankly, it doesn't matter what your political perspective is, and from every discipline in the country. It is a deep concern with the lagging productivity that we have in Canada, which has become evident, really. It was there before if you were looking, but it's really become evident over the last 3 years. And it is front and center on as a matter of national concern. So Danny, start us off here. First of all, how do you explain it? There's a fairly dramatic increase, certainly between us and what was formerly our good next door neighbor. But nevertheless, the gap is growing. It's less with European members of the OECD. So sometimes you could argue we're comparing ourselves to the leader of the pack that has run away with the field, but that doesn't matter because we're in an integrated economy with the United States. So take us through it.
Okay, so I think first, let's just make sure we understand why it's important to even care about productivity and innovation. So productivity, which was, by the way, word in my scenes, I also was in the federal government for a year and a half. And when I joined the federal government, it was still not allowed to use the word productivity because politicians thought it's a bad word. So let me explain why it's important first. It's important because if you want to increase welfare, but especially the thing we all feel, and that is our wages, the money we bring home every month, we have to increase productivity. Productivity is basically how much. I'm a business. I want to pay my workers more. I need to make more money. And I make more money per worker, so I can pay them more by increasing productivity. You don't do that, you cannot increase wages, period.
So just to build into that argument, if we don't, I would think, if we don't increase productivity, we don't have a surplus to redistribute for all the social programs that we run.
Correct.
Okay.
So from a point of view, we won't have that surplus, but also from a point of view of I'm running businesses in Canada, I cannot increase wages, salaries, because I don't earn more per workers. And that has been the case for at least 30 years in terms of productivity. And if you even look indeed at the wages, how much Canadian families bring home, since 76, we basically brought home the same thing, even though we are now much more educated and many more families have two working partners. And in the end, we still bring, in real terms, what we brought home at 76. And that is because our productivity is lagging. It's even worse, as I said, because not only we have two partners working, but if you look at our leisure time, we Canadian have lost 10% of our leisure time since 76. So any one of you who is a parent, we lost several months, about 8 months of spending real time with our children between 0 to 18, because we need to work harder in order to get exactly the same amount of money. And that will not change unless we change productivity. And that's, again, it's a slopey slope, but after 30 years, we now all feel it.
That's a great way of explaining it because it brings it home, right? That lagging rate of productivity affects each and every one.
Yes. And the problem, if you look at productivity and how we can increase it, right? We are highly educated, and that's a puzzle. Okay, that's the other puzzle that we talked about. We are maybe the most highly educated country in the world. You look at our labor force, yes, we are. Yes. Okay. That's just the facts. Sure. We are one of the most highly educated people in the world, and our labor force is, if you look at statistics, the most highly educated. And yet, if you look at the way we are using this workforce, in terms of what's called total factor productivity or multi-factor productivity, which is what mostly economists invented in order to say, this is a fact, we don't know what's happening, but you could put good people and good technology and magic happen, we are really, really bad. And that's a puzzle. And it can be explained by one other thing that we don't do. And that is both our private businesses, but also the public service, do not engage with new knowledge and do not engage with new technology. So you said we are doing not so well compared to our beloved neighbors south of the borders. We're actually not doing so well compared to the whole G7 or G8. If you look at capital and new technology investment, Canada is always the last one.
So say a little more about that, Danny, because it engage with our workforce and the new technology. It's a very broad category. Talk about our relative investments in new technology and in new knowledge per worker, which is a figure that we can compare ourselves to. Where are we on the leaderboard here?
The last one. So we are not in the leaderboard. We are, unless you tilt it the other way and then we win. But right now we have the last one. We have the last one in investment in new technology, the last one in capital investment, the last one in business investment in new R&D and innovation. You look at the complexity of our economy and how, whether we have become more advanced and more complex in the things we do. And actually since 76, we're going down. Basically any proxy you would look for how we are using knowledge, both in the public sector and in the private sector, has a relative decline compared to not just our peers, but to all, I should say, OECD countries.
So here's an argument I heard today, and you tell us where it's wrong. One of the reasons we have so little, relatively speaking, investment, especially in the public service, which is a very large proportion of our economy, larger than others. So it's a part of the productivity problem. We have legacy systems, and those legacy systems, we have a history of underinvestment. And so we are diverting capital to repair and maintain legacy systems. Not very well, but we're doing it. And it's starving both sectors for new investment. Are you persuaded?
No, it sounds like a bad excuse from some of my students. Slightly better than the dog ate
Well,
my
this came from
homework.
public officials. You see?
I am not surprised. So if you would go to a different country, like south of a border, and you're going to tell them, I have a problem with legacy system, they will tell you, yeah, it's exactly the problem. You have legacy system. You're now investing so much more in those legacy and they are not as productive. You just need to buy new stuff. Why don't you buy new stuff? Why don't you change your legacy system instead of trying to maintain them? So it sounds like a really bad excuse of, again, somebody, not surprising, coming from the public sector, that does not like the risk, and that's a real problem in the public sector, of dealing with new technology and innovation because you might fail. In the legacy system, it's great. It's what we have used always. If I can even only slightly improve it, everything is fine. I'm trying something new, I might fail.
How do you deal with that risk aversion? How do you deal with culture? Aside from the capital investment and the new knowledge, and how do you deal with that culture?
So there's two things. Okay, one is this argument about culture is not an argument that I buy on the business sector or about Canadian. And the reason is that all our beloved students who, by the time they finish university, are immersed in the Canadian culture, mysteriously move across the border and become unbelievably successful entrepreneurial in the United States. So is it the culture or is it the institutional system of Canada? That's one. The second is, if you take cynicism aside and you look at what business wants to do, and what business really wants to do is to have the highest profit for the lowest amount of risk. If I'm a CEO, I want to have a minimum risk and a minimum uncertainty and the highest profit. And you look at what Canadian business do, and they're probably the best in this. Their profit margin of Canadian corporation are as good, if not better, than almost any other country, while they don't have to innovate. And that's a system problem, and that's something that the government should deal with.
Now, is that a structure again? If we're talking system level now rather than individual level, is that in part a function of the fact that we have an oligopoly in many, many sectors, which makes it much easier not to innovate, not to compete while preserving profit margins?
So you can quote me, yes, but it's not the only problem because again, you look at the history of Canada and until about 2000, we were actually moving in the right direction.
So what changed?
If you think about it and you start to think about what are the two biggest things that change, one is the world trading system. And especially in Canada, if you look around 96, we signed a specific agreement, which Trump changed its name and might probably change its name again now that he is coming as a president. And if you look at what we agreed upon as a way in which Ottawa and our businesses think of how the economy should work, you can suddenly understand a lot of stuff. We sort of assumed and believed in free trade as if there is a real market without understanding what you just hinted, that if you look at every country, especially the United States, the state is extremely active in making sure that you have real competition, because if you don't have real competition, you don't have real markets. And the second thing that happened is that we changed our government. We changed our public service. And from a public service that was trained to come up with ideas, hash them, debate them publicly, forcefully, but debate them, then agree and come up with solution, we now have a much more meek public service. By the way, brilliant people, they're just in a system in which they are incentivized not to actually come up with new ideas.
Okay, stop over that, because that's one of the most mysterious elements of the predicament that we're in, because Danny's right. We've had absolutely amazing people. The public service, especially the Department of Finance that you were in, Danny, attracted the best and the brightest in this country. The envy of many in the world. What happened that you really, and I'm going to exaggerate what you said and you pull it back, but that we have denuded the senior civil service of policy chops, of policy capacity. How did that happen? What is this?
So first of all, when you buy into a worldview that basically says the market will take care of everything, and you also look at what happened around 96, where I think we were slightly too much in the other direction. You have a lot of politicians that basically says, if it's the market and if we need a correction, we need to create a public service that actually does not have the ability to do any strategic thinking, does not have the ability, because remember, those are the years in which what we now all claim is important. Industrial policy was the word that should not be using. Only stupid people did industrial policy for about 20 years, meaning the whole world but Canada. And we basically dismantle the departments that could do that. We also, and I think, again, if you go to Ottawa, you can understand why politicians love it. You created a public service which is more make. So the politicians feel as if they have more power. They set the goals, and then the public service will just figure out a way to make what they want happen instead of offering suggestions. When that happens, you start to have less capabilities, and you want even more power and more centralization. You start to use more and more political advisors. We now have several hundreds of them running as an organization from the PMO. I don't know how many of you know, but ministers do not choose the chief of staff.
No.
It's people in the PMO that choose the chief of staff for even the most important ministers.
And people in the PCO choose deputies for the minister. So the minister has no choice, either at the professional civil service level or with respect to their own staff.
Exactly. And those people then, you now have, very similar to what I have to say I found in China when I was writing about China, you have two parallel organizations that try to run the country. The public servants actually do not know who they should report to. And none of those organizations, their real personal incentives is to help Canada.
Let me just go back for a second, because there's an interesting argument here that we want to come back to. I heard an association, I would never use causal argument with you, Danny, but there's an association here between a rejection of industrial policy and a deterioration in the public service.
It's industrial policy, but it's also any idea of that our public service should be involved in creating long-term strategy.
Okay, let's talk about that.
Okay, so
talk about that. What's long-term strategy? How do four-year governments on four-year electoral cycles create long-term strategy?
That's an excellent question for politicians, but the role of public service is that when the government comes, and as I said, they have 4 years, there are files and strategy to, if somebody decide to decide what are the most important goals. And then if you have a leader, instead of them now spending 2 years to figure out what it is that they might be able to do, you already have those plans. And you also have one thing that our public servant and government no longer have, and that's operational capacity. And operational capacity means actually doing stuff, from industrial policy to educational policy to housing policy. It's not just writing a check. And
so doing stuff, executing on strategy, or actually having a capacity to deliver in the field?
Both. I think we have a serious problem with operational capacity. We've seen it again and again. I used on purpose the example that one of our growing industries in 2023, 2024 was exporting stolen cars through our ports. The CRA has now 55,000 employees and can't answer half of the phone calls for Canadian. This is basic operational capacity.
One more question on this one, because it's at the top again of the national agenda. We have a civil service that has grown in size by 40%, more so than almost anybody else. Karen, you're nodding your head there, in recent times. And yet you're saying there's no operational capacity. Where do those two lines cross?
Remember what we talked about productivity? Productivity is becoming more efficient. Remember, we talked about innovation and the use of technology. If you don't take new knowledge, if you don't enhance productivity, if you don't bring new solutions, you add more people, by way, over-educated and over-skilled people to use the same old equipment because they're so skilled, they can just do enough that things doesn't look as the whole thing come crossing, tumbling down. What you do is you just add more people, but you don't become more efficient.
I actually think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that adding more people past that point is a negative. Because now, when I have my last exchange with the government department, instead of having to get 8 signatures, they now need 22, right? So that's gonna take 2.5 times longer to get the same productivity that we might have had 5 years ago. So it's almost as if I can't solve this problem. I'm going to throw people at it instead of thinking about alternatives.
Absolutely. But I have to say that this is, and this is where both the public sector, but also the private sector in Canada are failing. And where we, which are extremely good, if you look especially bang per dollar, in coming up with new ideas, new inventions, fail to make them into innovation in both the public service and the private sector.
I'm going to ask you an out of the ballpark question. If you don't want to answer it, don't answer it. But I don't think it's news to anybody in this room that if following a federal election, there is a change in party, top of the agenda is cuts. Significant cuts, certainly to the federal civil service, right? That is what's being discussed. The stupidest way to do cuts under any circumstances are across the board cuts. We all know that, anybody who's ever had any leadership role. What's the strategic approach, Danny, to reshaping the Canadian public service so that it would be more fit for purpose, given the challenges you're talking about? Because the public services, our governments are 40% of our GDP, 40%.
Including the provinces.
Yes,
let's just
provinces,
be very clear.
Federal government and municipal governments.
Yes.
40%, right? So we can't look away and say they don't matter. They really do matter.
So I think you're missing the most important step. So as you know, since you've been the leader, you actually need to know where you want to lead. And we did not have a discussion about what a successful Canada should look like in 5 or 10 years in this country.
Answer that question.
For about 30 years.
Answer that question. What should a successful Canada look like in 5 to 10 years?
Well, first of all, let me say what it should not look like.
Okay.
And it should not look like the United States. I'm sorry. It's very clear that we don't want to, in everything that we have actually been doing successfully for the last 40, 50 years, it's very clear that we don't want to look like the United States. And yet we constantly try to imitate the United States, which is beyond me why we do that. I won't go as to why, psychologists.
So let me play devil's advocate.
But let me say one other thing.
Okay.
I do think that what we have done, and we are still world leaders, is in K-12 education. Let's forget us, universities. Let's just forget us. And you look at also the way that we have been doing it. So if you look, there's a thing called PISA, which is standardized tests all around the world.
Yeah.
And you look not only we are as good as it gets once you take city-states out, Korea and Japan that don't have immigration out, we're the top.
Right.
We are declining in that, and that's a real worry, but we are the top. But also, if you look at whether you were born in Canada, not born in Canada, which schools you go to, where in the country, and inside the schools, we have a less variant. And that has hold over multiple governments, in multiple provinces, multiple parties.
So that when Dennis says less variance, less inequality.
Less
Right.
in the skills and education we give our people.
Right.
And we can have a philosophical debate, but I firmly believe that if you want to understand what a society, like what is its vision, you should look at how it educates very young. Yeah. And if you look at how we educated the young, we have a vision of highly skilled, creative, confident Canadian that go and get jobs that allow them to actually use those skills. Instead, we have highly educated, highly skilled, which we invest in them, Canadian, which are then used by both the public service, but especially the private sector. And I'm sorry, we have to fix the public sector, but we are not going to have a growing economy if we don't fix the private sector. That instead is using them as a subsidy in order not to invest in new innovation, not to invest in new capital, not to merge the talent with the new technology. And that's something we have to solve.
But that is a long-standing Canadian problem. That wouldn't.
Correct.
Right? This is a problem that people who've been working on Canada forever have identified, that the private sector is, relatively speaking, a poor investor in R&D in comparison. So that alone can't drive what's happened here.
No, but again, the thing that we should worry about, and we're more like the proverbial frog that you put in a pot of water and then slowly but surely keep the water are now boiling. Up until 2000, we were moving in the right direction, even in private business R&D. We used to have companies in the sectors that are resource sectors, from Inco to others, that were highly innovative, that did massive amount of R&D. You go to Sudbury and see what Inco was doing at the time. We have sold all of them. We are now in the resources, in our resources are controlled by decisions of multinational corporations. Some of them, by the way, are fully owned by foreign government. Again, just go to Sudbury and check Vale and check who owns Vale. It's called the Brazilian government. Yeah. And they make a decision about how to use our resources. So yes.
Take a walk back one step, because you're actually identifying another dimension of this, that our best companies are, the government doesn't sell them. Private entrepreneurs who build companies up to a certain level sell to foreign buyers.
It's a funny and interesting argument, because mysteriously it doesn't happen in other countries, right?
Well, that's right. So why does it happen?
So you should ask the people who authorize and also pushed for the sale of multiple of those companies. You should ask the people, in that case, the government, who, when a country you might heard about called Nortel, went belly up, and there was efforts by Canadian to buy it and keep it Canadian. The government insisted on not only selling it, but selling all the patent trove. And by the way, it was sold in such a horrific way that our friends south of the border, the Department of Justice, said, no, you cannot sell so much innovation that control all the telecommunication sector in the world as if it doesn't have consequence on global markets.
So if you actually take that story apart, and that's a classic nightmare, the Nortel story. It's just a nightmare. Let's make it worse, because the R&D that went into Nortel, which was a flagship company in Canada, was government money, a lot of government money to create intellectual property, which was sold in the private market to private buyers outside this country. So if you think about that, that's a double catastrophe, really, from the point of view of forward-looking investment.
And I can tell you, because I won't name the companies, but some of them are no longer liked in Canada.
No.
But they love Nortel people and Nortel R&D and Nortel capabilities, and also other capabilities that we have. And indeed, most of the R&D assets and power that we created with our own money is now owned by foreign companies, even if it's still around Nortel.
How do you change that then?
So first of all, we have to accept that this is the situation. We made mistakes. We no longer have big companies.
Yeah.
We probably are too late in the
Just
game.
interrupt you for 1 second, because we have Karen here, who the director of our School of Cities. Not having these companies headquartered in our cities is a tremendous cost to our urban infrastructure and our social infrastructure, because they champion philanthropic activities in the cities in which they're in. And we don't have many head offices left in our big cities in Canada. So it's not only a business cost, it's a social cost.
It's also a social cost, because the most interesting jobs for the people we just invested in educating just don't happen in Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. So if you want really interesting jobs in headquarters and learning how to run those companies, you don't have that opportunity in Canada, and you leave. But
change that.
That is gone.
Because there's none left to sell out, that's why.
Well, I think we have tech, but we are going to sell that one as well.
Yeah.
So don't worry. Glencore is my guess. But we have to understand what we have. We also have to understand that the world has changed. And we need to figure out where we're still good at. So let me try to come with a positive story about Sudbury and other mining, instead of just saying how horrible we are. What really happened in Sudbury, I don't know how many of you visited Sudbury in the last 20 years. It's actually a nice place now, with a lot of lakes, some good restaurants, happy people, and in quite a lot of money in jobs that are not only R&D. And it used to be the place where no trees were able to grow, and we had environmental catastrophe.
Right.
It also now have, especially around hard rock mining, an ecosystem of flourishing companies that actually came to be because Inco and the others went down, and there was an opening. And not only that, you look at the most successful of those companies. They were mostly concentrated in Northern Ontario and a little bit of Quebec. And there was a government intervention which understood that those kind of people who comes from a mine and was always working in Sudbury and Timmins don't know how to export, and actually explain why export is important, and then help them to export. And many of them started to export and become really important in the mining. So not necessarily the miners and the mine owner, but all the technology that goes there, all the design of mines, all the equipment that goes there. I think this is where we need to focus much more on. We also, going back to your story, need to figure out that we do need to have basically economic nationalism. And it's not okay that Swedish companies now go to Sudbury and basically pick the best companies out. Instead, 2 or 3 of those companies with help, and the help is not just a big check, can become one of the top provider of equipment and other services. We are now constantly talking about semiconductors. And if you look at semiconductors, one of the most important companies in the world that the United States now pay, I would say, a lot of bribes to come and work in Arizona, is a Taiwanese company that does not produce new chips, but it's the only company that know how to take the latest design and make them into a chip.
Yeah.
And they're innovating. We are probably more innovative in almost any other semiconductor industry company. We need to figure out how to do this in our resource industries, in our health industries. We no longer talk about COVID, but everybody talked about COVID. They talked about two companies, Pfizer and Moderna. You actually look at each and every vaccine that was produced. There was a Swiss company behind it that made a very large amount of a profit. There was specialty glass makers that each and every vial was produced by them. This is, I think, where we need to focus. This is where we can grow. And we might not be as famous as Google, Alphabet, Meta, but it's okay if we'll have 5 TMC that sits here on the global economy.
So I love this story. I love the story for two reasons, Danny. One, you're looking at not the obvious sectors, sites of innovation. Innovation takes place in many sectors, and you're saying, do the analysis, do the hard work. What are the sectors in which we have assets where both human and technical, where we can bring to bear a focus, and to the extent it's not an obvious sector, that may be an advantage, which is not the way most people think about productivity in Canada, frankly.
And I think also we need to understand what is our competitive and comparative advantage. Right. We're a huge country with a huge amount of variance. If we copy and cut things that work for New York and San Francisco, it might work for Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, but then there's about 98% of the rest of the country. What are we offering them? And not only what are we offering them, but why don't we use them as a competitive advantage in order to do something else, to figure out how Canada can compete instead of how can Canada look like south of the border.
Take us back to the mines for 1 minute, because I don't think many people think about mining as a technology story, but it's a technology story.
It's a complete technology story.
Tell the story.
For two reasons. A, how many of you think that we want to have a green transition and stop climate change? Well, let's say about half.
More. They're just shot.
Yes. Without mining at least an order of magnitude from an ever-growing list of things that people call critical minerals, that almost every week there's another mineral, we are not going to have a green transition. That's one. So we have to mine 10 to 15 times more than what we mine now, which is the most the humanity ever mined. Second, if we mine it in the technologies and the global business structure we have now, the environment catastrophe will never be fixed, but no matter how much green tech we have. So I don't want to say bad thing about the best advisor of President-elect Trump. So let's look at the Chinese electric cars. People think that electric cars now are, if I buy an electric car, I'm great for the economy. Look how your batteries are made. And if they're made with nickel from Indonesia, you have created such an environment disaster that even if you use that car for 15 years, it will be nothing compared to what you did in another part of the world. If we don't fix that by innovation, second, in order to get to those more minerals and metals, we need to figure out how to recycle all the tailing, the massive amount of waste we did around the world. We need to reach 2 miles below ground. I don't know how many of you figure it out, but it's really hot, 2 miles. It's not for humans. And as a matter of fact, you go to a mine now, there are very few miners. You have people that play computer games on basically massive drones, if you want to think. It's actually huge mining machines, but they're actually playing video games with joysticks. Yeah. And they can do it inside the mines, they can do it outside mines. Yeah. Mines have digital twins. Everything that we do in artificial intelligence and ICT, if we can control that for the mining sector, we'll have several billions of dollars coming to Canada every year. We might not have the most highly capitalized, valued company on NASDAQ, but we'll have several billions of dollars coming to Canada every year.
I think that's such an important point. It's almost in a non-obvious sector, it's still an innovation story and it's still a technology story. So we have to shift away from a very, and all of Danny's scholarship makes that argument, right?
I hope.
Yes, it really does. It really, what other sector? Mining is.
Well, we have a place called British Columbia, which apart from fires also produce a lot of wood. And yet when COVID was here, we could not build anything because we have no access to the wood because we no longer know what to do apart from grow the tree and cut it. I worked a lot with Finland. You look at Finnish forests and by the way, British Columbia forests, all the equipment and the technology and the management there of growing those forests are from Finland. Why we don't have any Canadian company in that sector is beyond me. Why Finland, let's keep on with Finland and Sweden, have constant new technologies of what you do and use wood for, from biological fuels to paper, to everything else, to the timber that we have here. Why does Canada have to buy it? They're like basically sell the wood and then buy it back with a massive value add and also have that wood travel 6,000 miles? Again, it's beyond me. We can go to agriculture.
Yeah.
We can go to
huge sector for this country in which, secure food is one of the biggest issues globally. And we are such a major player and we do have innovative companies. Actually, Nutrien is a company that is an innovation leader in what it does. But it's not enough, frankly. So I think that's an important part of it. So if you're looking at the priorities, what you're really saying is how do we lead? We do the hard work first. To finding where our comparative advantage is, what assets we have, and how we focus.
And also let's give one example from health.
Yeah.
It's one thing to try to have a biotech, VC-based biotech industry that try to compete with Silicon Valley. It's another thing saying the age of tailored medicine is coming. Producing those drugs is still more an art than anything else. Whoever is going to control that is going to become the new TSMC of human health. Why don't Canada focus on that? Why not Canada? We can ask the other Professor Breznitz. We had CISRAF here, a massive amount for 10 years on medicine by design. Why we never think, and we now have another one in chemistry, the accelerator. Why don't we think 5 years into those CISRAF? How do we translate that to have an industry in Canada? Instead of after 10 years, basically saying, you did such a great thing in research, bye-bye. Yeah. And see all of that move to United States, Korea, Denmark.
So, I was telling Danny earlier today that we ran a really interesting accelerator program for 40 senior civil servants who came to the Munk School and will be coming back because they're going to institutionalize this now. And here's the question one of them asked me, and frankly, the sparks went off in my head. So I have learned now, don't answer when that happens, wait. How would you answer this question? This person says to me, well, just look at industrial policy. This government invested all this money in electric batteries. I guess that's money down the drain, isn't it? What's your answer?
polite answer would be,
We're on the
since-
record here.
yeah, since I was in government, I and nobody else was aware of it. There was a process of creating industrial policy and a plan and decisions about what are the options and where should Canada play in them before we decided to give a huge amount of money to foreign companies to do a very specific set of actions. So everything he said might be true apart from claiming that this is industrial policy. This was just an investment strategy, basically made decisions weren't made in less than 30 days. This is not how you do strategy. This is how you make deals and then regret them later.
I think so. This is a strategy problem.
Yeah.
It's a failure to do strategy, which comes back to having the capacity to do strategy and the patience to do it and enough political space.
And let me be slightly more provocative. I am shocked that we are shocked that Trump says that he wants to have tariffs, as if Trump was never a president before, and he never did that.
I'm shocked that we're shocked too.
And then not only that, instead of, because we don't have a strategy and we don't have a vision, instead of saying, here's what we're going to do, and this is how we go to our goal, we basically go to a buoy. And at least for the first month said, oh, just please don't hurt us too much until we figure it what we want to be.
Let me come back to it. Let me come back to a different answer to that question about
Yes.
industrial policy, because I think there's a deep public misunderstanding of how you do successful industrial policy, and is this true in Canada too? My answer was, well, if you have an investment portfolio for yourself and you make 10 investments and one is bad, but 2 are really great, that's just fine, right? Now, when I said that to the senior public servant, they stepped back. They thought about it for a moment, but what that conversation was telling me, there is no tolerance for any highly visible public failure. And you can't do industrial policy if you have zero tolerance for a mistake.
I actually think you can't even do innovation in the public service if you have zero tolerance.
Right.
And indeed, one of the things we have to do is change that. But while we change that, we also have to figure out how we create organization within the public service that can very quickly again, I'm sorry to use that, decide the vision of where our country wants to be, says here are the 5 most important things we have to have action now, and create much more nimble organization, which are arm lengths from the government, because that's exactly what you will get. And let them run and let them experiment and let them fail.
What are the 5 areas?
Well,
Take a guess. Because we haven't done the research, right?
we have not done the research,
No.
but definitely we already made a massive investment in mining.
Yeah.
And it's
Health.
going to stay. Health.
For sure.
Let's assume we want British Columbia to stay healthy and wealthy. We have to deal something with wood and agriculture.
Yeah.
And that also going to help other
And
provinces.
that's the whole west of the country too.
Yes.
I mean, our agro, food and agricultural exporters
And energy.
and energy.
I mean, I know
Yeah.
it's very unfashionable to talk about oil and gas, but we have a lot of them.
Well, there's a long transition. I don't think anybody who
And
works in the
Newfoundland.
sector. And the minimum is a 30-year transition.
At least.
Right.
And by the way, use oil and gas for other things as well, especially oil, if you want petroleum and you want, there's a lot of good things that can happen.
So I'm going to open it up to the audience. So get your questions ready because there's so many great people in this room. I'm going to ask Demi two more and then we're going to go to the audience, okay? And these are two in my field, which is
Okay.
not fair. But let me ask you these two, Danny, just because.
How we solve world peace?
No.
No, because
I
that's
know
your
how to
field.
do that. I don't need any advice on that, but let me ask you two. You've worked on China.
Yeah.
And you look at China's economy now, which its leadership has clearly made a decision is not transitioning to a consumption economy. It's moved way up the value chain and is now competing in high value exports in ways that, because of the incapacity to consume at home, the amount of high value exports that are coming in to global markets is frankly unprecedented. How does Canada compete in that kind of global economy? It's not only a Canadian problem, it's a European problem, it's a Japanese problem, it's a US problem. But how does Canada fit into that larger jigsaw?
So you basically asked me how to solve the China problem?
No, I'm asking, no, that's up to the Chinese, right?
Yes.
But this is the new China. It is not the same China that we thought about 15 years ago.
So there's a few things. If you actually look at global, so everything that we now produce are now produced by global production or value chain. You say China, but it's actually made all over.
Yeah.
If you look at what happened, especially since COVID, but also because of the way China now behaves, most companies no longer want to be fully based or controlled by China.
Right.
So you're going to have a few more regional networks of production. They may not be 80% of production, but they might reach 25, 30%. So a real question is how much of that we can have in Canada? Because we don't have a problem of 1.4 billion citizens. We have maybe we'll reach 50, 60. So we don't need 85%. We need just enough. The second is, again, in the area I work, there's a very reasonable chance that we will have a fracture of various technology standards and systems, which I actually view, I do believe in competition. I actually view as not a bad thing if it does not lead to war and isolation. Once you do that, again, you have a massive opportunity to innovate. You also have a massive opportunity as Canada, especially when you have, excuse my language, a crazy president in the US, a crazy president in Russia, very unreliable instrumental leaders of China. If you put yourself as we are sane and we're open to the world, just as a hedge. And for Canada, it's enough if we are just the second place where in production, investment, and all the rest of the world hedge.
I think it's a real opportunity for us. I really do. But it's, again, it requires.
It requires a decision. So I'm sorry. It's forget discipline, we need to make a decision about what we want to do. We may actually need to make a decision what we are and where we want to be in 5 or 10 years. Not just, but actual decisions, and explain how we even know where we get them and start acting. Instead, with all due respect to this government, for 10 years, we have massive amount of announcement and very little in terms of action, and also decisions about how do we even know we are approaching where we want to be when we refuse to make a decisions about what it is that we're trying to be.
Last question before we go to all of you, and this is a very tactical question right now. We are coming up on next Monday. I would be shocked if there were not tariffs, you're in government, what advice would you give then?
Well, we actually need to look back to what we did the last time, and I think we did it okay. I don't think this government can make decisions about what it is that we want to do. They have failed to do it for 10 years, I'm sorry. But what they did the last time Trump was here is explaining very carefully and very strategically or tactically that it's actually going to hurt Trump. And that's what I will do. As a matter of fact, I am shocked that this was our first reaction. And instead we went to his golf castle in Florida to, I will not go further because it's public, but I have some harsh words about what we did in that table. Instead of saying, that's a game you want to play, fine, here's the game we played last time, and now we're going to double it up. Let's see how long you're going to survive.
All right, there's a fierce debate for anybody who doesn't know, fierce, active, ongoing debate about exactly this. Let me go to the audience now. And yes, the person, if you tell us your name at the back of the room, if you can get there, please identify yourself.
Thanks. Thank you very much. My name is Jim Malonis, QIG Macro. And I guess first, I was just a little surprised by the recommendations because it seemed like productivity is critical to prosperity. The US is the best in productivity. Canada is the best in education. But the recommendation is don't be like the US, get more education. So I just didn't really understand that.
So let me be very clear. I don't think that in Canada, we are going to win the game of venture capital, ICT, full run into financial exits. And also, I don't think it would help Canada because the financial exit will be to the US. I think that we need to, instead of constantly looking at the US, we mentioned Taiwan, we mentioned Finland, we can mention Denmark, we can mention Switzerland, we can mention to a degree Korea as a model of how we can compete. Because we are going to lose in the US game. If I'm, and I was a startupist, and I have any chance to open my company in the US with US money and with US laws, I will do it in a second. I won't stay here. And I don't see this changing anytime soon. I also see the impacts of how this game is played, of private equity and VCs, and you see massive growing inequality. I mean, that's actually what you get from success. So the question is, how can we use what we have, not how we can have more education, but how we can use the fact we have so much education to create jobs that actually uses those skills. And we have already tried now for what, 40 years at least to play the US games without great success. Maybe we should try other playbooks. That's basically it.
I was just gonna say, but how would you embrace the US game? The US game is competition. The US game is a more robust financial sector. The US game is deregulation. We haven't embraced those things. So we haven't done that effectively. So why would we try to do something different or do more of what we already have?
So first of all, we need to have more competition. We need to have more deregulation. It actually would be help if we can actually export between provinces more easily. I advised with others in the IPL to the fintech sector 10 years ago, and they had to have something like 32 different provincial agencies approved before they can even sell a product. That's ridiculous. Okay?
It is totally ridiculous.
We need to change that, but we also need to figure out how we are not just obsessed about trying to have more VC financial exit on NASDAQ or being sold for US companies.
We could compensate for almost any conceivable Trump tariff if we reduced interprovincial tariffs. All right, just to drive home. How ridiculous. it
How
is.
ridiculous and how many entrepreneurs and companies we lose because it's easier to sell to the whole of the United States than to sell to Quebec.
Yeah,
It's like ridiculous.
yeah. Yes, go ahead. You've had your hand up. The young gentleman. Yes. Yeah.
Hi,
We're
Jones.
gonna get around to everybody. Just be patient.
Hi, Jones Perlman. So clearly, you're also addressing the problem of federalism and confederalism here. Is there any role for the regional development agencies, for instance, or like ACOA or like Quebec's agency, right? Because I come from Halifax, and our regional development agency isn't that good, and my perception is kind of the rest of them aren't. So, is there sort of a role for the regional agencies and the provinces to play, or does it slowly have to be a top-down federal model? What are your thoughts on that?
So let me tell you what I think China did extremely successfully, which is almost the opposite of a story we hear about China. If you look at the opening up of China until very recently, and even today, but especially until Xi, the central government of China basically said, you're now allowed to play. They never had a prospective policy. And then different regions compete and experiment on how to play.
Huawei was a local company.
And
Local.
ZTE was a local company, and
ZTE was.
Tencent was a local company, and BYD is a local company, and I can go on and on. And actually, they had multiple provisional games, those that were successful, and only after they were successful, the central government would come and say, oh, yes, this is what we meant all along. We need to scale this up.
So
Okay.
Danny, they didn't have a strategy. They just created space.
No, but they created space in specific areas
Yes.
with specific, let's call it, borders of how you play, right?
Right.
They also put a lot of resources around.
Ton.
And the other thing that I have to say, I think Janice would agree, I don't think our federal government in our lifetime, or at least in the lifetime that will help my children, would become what it used to be, or can even engage. I also don't see a federal government, the way we organize it, actually know what needs to be done in Halifax.
Yeah, it's a mistake.
That needs to be done there.
Yeah.
Again, I can be on the record, not all provinces and not all, let's call them local government, are much more effective, much more highly productive than the federal government. We actually need many more of those experiments to see what works. Those that works and can be imitated in other provinces, great. But right now, we actually have too much of top-down that prevent a lot of those experimentation unless the provincial government basically give a finger to Ottawa and does what it wants.
I agree 1,000%.
So I want more provincial.
It's a second row right there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you think that the monetization of real estate in Canada has had a deterrent effect on local investors investing in R&D and things that are higher risk, first of all. Secondly, whether the age of communication strategies has displaced industrial policy, which is certainly my perception. And finally, I'm loath to admit this, but I think I've sat in this meeting already in 1981. At that time, I authored a book that was signed by the Minister of Industry in Ontario, Larry Grossman. It became known as the Purple Book, and it was entitled Towards a Canadian Common Market. We had at that time a foreign investment review agency. John Kenneth Galbraith had written The Multinational Corporation and the Nation State. I had come from finance and was assigned to write a letter from the Minister of Industry to the Minister of Finance listing what should be done for R&D. I wrote a 7-page question. Okay, here's the question. I have to tell you this, you'll love this. I wrote a 7-page letter. I was subsequently moved back to finance, where my first assignment was to respond to my recommendations. My question is, how did we spend 45 years doing less than nothing?
That's a great question and a great story, by the way.
You have to ask your boss back then.
No, I
how-
want to ask the person who responded to her letter.
Yes,
how that
exactly.
happened.
So there's one thing that we do have to remember, right? We now, finally now, I think our eyes are open to the consequences of not doing something for 45 years. But you saw it, many other people saw it, as I kept telling the government, the last thing you want is another blue ribbon and a committee report. We have about 15 of those. They're all really smart. Just read them, please. When you're rich, you're very comfortable. And the quality of life for most Canadians has been until lately and still is quite well. You don't have a drive to succeed. And politicians, and that's, I think, our fault. I mean, I can say a lot of bad things about politicians if you want, but our fault as Canadians is we didn't demand. So they did whatever they did, which is nothing for 45 years. I haven't seen many Canadians going to the street and demanding change. So why should they change their behavior?
What about the real estate question?
So the real estate question, and I think it's not just the real estate, it's the other. We have created a system in which if I'm an entrepreneur and I don't care, or a business person, but especially entrepreneurs, and I want to stay in Canada and I want to make money and I don't really care about how, why should I do productive entrepreneurship?
It's harder.
And we are not unique in that.
No.
You have seen every country that has done that end up in some kind of economic crisis.
That's a China story in real estate.
China, Ireland, I don't know how many of you remember what happened after they declared themselves to be the Celtic Tiger. The United States with the house. I mean, it's a mistake that seems that we, humanity, does not learn how to stop.
And in part because it's easy.
And a lot of money, a lot of people makes a lot of money.
Okay, there was a question, I'm just gonna alternate between sides of the room. There was a question over here. You had a question, yes.
Thanks. So my name is Peter Vanderbilt. I am a venture capitalist, and you should teach in the Munk school what the VC power law is. VC power law, for those of you who don't know it, is that only 20% of the companies in my portfolio are going to win. And the discipline in our business is picking those winners, but the bigger discipline in our business is shutting down the losers and not owning the losers, right? And that's the problem with government. They get too paranoid about having losers, right? And so you should teach this. Second, foreign investment.
It wouldn't help if we did, let me just tell you.
I can also tell you that Darius and I teach the first year course innovation. We teach that, by the way, we assume only 10%.
Yeah,
Not 20. So
fair, but it is actually about 20%, but it is what makes the difference.
Yep.
And it's about doubling down on the winners and backing away from the losers as fast as you can. That's what makes venture work. The other thing you talked about is foreign investment. And I love that topic because the problem with foreign investment is not all foreign investment is equal, right? So $20 million from somebody going into TD Bank, who cares? But the problem is even more pervasive in my industry, because what happens today is some great entrepreneur has a business. It's valued at $50 million. He goes out and raises $50 million from US VCs. And what's happened in that moment? Change of control.
Mhm.
Change of control. We have sold the best intellectual property in our company, in our country, for a fraction of its long-term value, right? And it goes to industrial policy. We think foreign investment in all forms is good. It's not, right? We have to first value capture. We have to extract the value from those companies before we get to that liquidity event, so that we actually get all the other benefits that you talked about, which are entrepreneurs who get rich and then do philanthropic things, entrepreneurs who get rich and then start other businesses, pension plans that make money and help their pensioners have better lives. And so then when you talk about life sciences, which is one of the topics most people here won't know, it's the most productive part of the VC ecosystem. It's outperformed every part of the VC ecosystem for the last decade. 9 out of the 10 best exits in this country come from life sciences companies. Here's the problem. The value capture, 10%. Who's captured most of that value? US foreign investors. And who's backed those foreign investors? 96 US pension plans. 4 Canadian pension plans, 5 European pension plans. We need to have a much bigger vision in this country about how we get value capture and drive a virtuous circle. That was a bit of a monologue, but that's what I'm thinking about.
I agree. As a matter of fact, in my book, that's exactly what I say. And not only that, let me give an example. Hopefully people still remember. Is a company called RIM, now called BlackBerry, and there's a company called Shopify. And if you look at the fact that BlackBerry RIM had almost only Canadian investors, when they had their liquidity event, all that money went back to Canada and got reinvested. When Shopify went public, most of the money immediately went to Wall Street, and especially, and then with another extra 90% sold back to Canadian.
But I want to give you one virtuous circle out of
We're just, you know what, we're gonna keep, I just want to make sure we're. Yeah.
Three entrepreneurs from Shopify are in our funds and our big investors back in the ecosystem. That's what a virtuous circle is like.
That's right. Oh, okay, I'm just, there's one young man at the very back of the room who's waving his hand frantically. We have to let him in.
Hello,
Hello.
I'm a so-called productive entrepreneur, not in finance, you know, the people who profit off of our work. I've watched as my industry, our suppliers, the people who work with us have become extremely concentrated in only 10 years that I've been working in this area. I've literally watched as, yes, foreign investment, domestic investment, the pension funds come in, they suck everybody up, they put them all together and prices go up. This is where, you know, consumer prices are actually, you know, this is causing a lot of inflation. I'm an entrepreneur, so you probably don't expect me to say this, but do you see the recent updates to the Competition Act in Canada as a step in the right direction to potentially forestall this kind of activity? And if so, do you think that there are other things that need to be done to further this?
So I can tell you what I have told the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Industry in my role as an advisor. And I said that if you look at what they should do, it's not just giving check to industries, but they're supposed to take care of a market framework. And I asked, when was the last time they did it seriously? I think we all know the answer. And if we don't do that, why should the behavior be changed? All the people and organizations you talked about are making a lot of money. Why should they change their behavior? I mean, and then I'll let Janice take control. If I'm a CEO now of a Canadian business, I think I'm a genius, and I'm probably right, because I'm doing exactly what I should do in the system we created. So if you don't change that system, you're just going to have this again and again and
There's
again.
2 questions. I just want to follow up on the value capture. Because that's, again, an issue that is right at the top, right? And so let me make it just a little more specific and ask you, Danny, one of the problems, we've talked about this already, where we fail to capture value is it is public money that are the early investors in many, many of these sectors that we talk about. But it is private gain, and often the private gain is outside the country. Is there an opportunity here to force the system to pivot? Because this is a really endemic Canadian problem and so frustrating.
So I'm not sure you think my
That's okay.
answer is very
That's all right.
optimistic.
That's why we're in a university.
So if you look at what you just said and take away Canada and foreign money, this is an argument that has been done by many Americans about the American system. If you look at the most successful companies from SpaceX to Apple, almost all the technologies were used for sometimes 20, 30 years, and God only knows how many billions, not trillions of dollars were funded by the public. And in the end, you have Elon Musk. Okay? That's just the way the system works.
But it was funded by American public
Agreed.
money, and the value was captured in the
Agreed.
United States.
No, but your question had those two things. So on that thing, I'm sorry, unless you're going to change capitalism, I'm not quite sure how you're going to change that. The question, which I think we can change, is how to keep more of a volume economy.
Right.
And there's two ways. A, tomorrow we're not going to have more Canadian pension funds suddenly behaving as white knights. Even if we change the rules, it will take time. But, and not now, but we can talk about it later, what other countries have done is at least play a delay game.
Yeah.
So even if the money
Or
comes
fails after.
from the US, the company grows bigger and bigger in your country. So even if it's sold, not just go public, which is a great, Shopify is a wonderful story.
Yeah.
So much more of that company, its jobs, its growth, its revenue, its IP stay in that country. That's basically has been the game that Israel, until that war, tried to play for 5 or 10 years. That's a game most small countries that have technology companies play. We were asleep on the wheel. I just, there's no other way to
So
describe
we're
it.
all agreed here. Yes, go ahead. Yes, yes.
Do you want to take a few questions?
But you know what?
So-
Maybe we'll take 2 because we're coming to the end of our time. You and there's somebody in the back.
Okay,
And
so,
then you'll be able to come up and talk to Danny after. So let's ask 2.
okay, so unlike the previous 2 people, I've spent most of my life working for big banks and with big oil companies and some tech. And I think there's another side to this problem. So if I look at the big banks, for example, you talked about everything being, taken over by foreign money. If there's any industry in Canada that's protected, it's the banks.
Yeah.
And I have to tell you, the banks are horrendously poorly run. And I've worked in the UK, I've worked in the US, I've seen they're horrendously. And what do? They continue to perpetuate regulation, like stopping open banking that protects them. So horrendously badly run and Canadian. Look at the oil companies, notwithstanding the fact that there was a lot of innovation in terms of actually turning the oil sands into real oil. For the most part, relative to most oil companies around the world, very Canadian. The internationals have been getting out, so it's become more Canadian, but they have no interest in innovating. They talk about Pathways Alliance, but nothing's happening. They're incredibly backwards. And frankly, they were slave to the US until the bloody federal government, who does very little right, actually built a pipeline to, and they were the only ones who built the pipeline. So for me, and you talked about it earlier, I call this Canada's fat and happy problem, but even our Canadian industries, there's got to be more competition in Canadian banking or it's never going to figure itself out. The
Okay.
oil industry has to figure it out. What's the answer?
Okay, well, hold that question. We're gonna go, the last person sitting against the wall. Yeah.
Ken Graywell, Fourth Lane Partners. So I actually think I can wrap up a lot of the observations. So for my sins in life, I was an investment banker who broke up BC Nortel and Canadian Pacific in its 5 pieces. So I have deep empathy with some of the observations, including the prior comment. I guess I'll make an observation and a question. So to Peter's point, really global P and VC have been charging a toll. Like there's no value add. If you look behind the LPs, and Peter mentioned the 96, it's permanent capital, it's life insurance and pension plans. So Canadians, so I hope you're teaching game theory, because the world's leading professor actually is based in the US, but he's Canadian actually. So I hope our policy people and our business professors teach old fashioned game theory, because the Americans are kicking us off badly and we're looking sloppy. I guess the question to you is, and here's where I think can be a very positive surprise. So as an investor, I'm for the first time in a decade, extremely bullish on Canada. And I know we don't have time now to get bullish, so but I can share that after. But the question to you is, if you listening to you tonight, it's very clear. If I'm making this up, but if I'm the next Canadian Prime Minister, what I'll do is say, you fat, lazy oligopolies, you're now paying a tax. Oh, by the way, I'm going to trade you with Trump for opening up the market for our lower mid-market companies. So question for you is, it's not if we end up with US antitrust legislation, it's happening just like the 30s. We got Doji. Do you think Canadian, do we use the bargaining chip to trade our oligopolies to really open up the US market for our natural resource? More importantly, our lower mid-market private companies piece, I would think if they've made it in Canada with this far with all this regulation, they're probably pretty good at what they do. So what do you think of the SMEs and their ability to compete where they're the opposite of fat and lazy?
So these two questions are related.
Yes.
Yeah.
So,
Thank you.
so if you teach the history of industrial policy or political economy, you at some point have to teach about crony capitalism. And usually people refer to crony capitalism and things that happen in either a third world country or maybe in Japan. And I tend to say that we are the world leaders. We sit in Ontario. I don't know how many of you know, but I had actually had to pass through this experience. Our car insurance industry decide the rules about the car insurance, and banks decide the rules on the banks, and we can go on and on and on. Again, as a political scientist, political economy, I don't see any way in which the system as it is, unless a huge amount of Canadian demand it, or the system goes into severe crisis, that it will happen by itself. So a question relating to the question that we just had, if this will be imposed on us, and again, you look at other countries, the only time they did it is when they had to call the IMF, okay? It's not as if we are worse than anyone else. Let's not get to the IMF, okay? It's not a happy experience for anyone, especially the people who are not rich. Can we use this Trump or crisis or changing geopolitics? Yes, we can, but we need leadership. And right now, until when is the parliament supposed to be talking again?
24th.
We have no leadership. So I hope that somebody is thinking about those issues, and as soon as we can allow them to make decisions, they actually make the right decision. I am not sure that they do.
So I'm mindful of the clock in our online audience, but you have to tell us afterwards why you're so bullish on Canada. All right. We
Yes,
all
please.
want to know.
Yes.
So let me thank everybody. These were great questions and really a great conversation. If I can finish on a personal note, Danny is not a native-born Canadian. He came to this country, how many years ago now, Dan? 11. And I had the privilege of hiring Danny and his super wife, Sherry. And I made a big bet on these two people. And all my bets don't work out. I'm very similar to you, but if you make a bet, among others, and one works out the way Danny and Sherry Breznitz have to give to this country, the ROI on that bet is huge, is all I can say. We're fortunate to have Danny with us in this country and staying in this country and caring about this country. So thank you very much. Danny, don't give up.